It was one of those moments when time felt like it froze. "Don't move," Jimmy said, his voice calm but serious. His intense gaze locked on mine. And then he asked, "Luna, do you know guys Adam's apples shouldn't move randomly?" Confused, I asked, "What happens if it does?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in, kissing me so deeply that I had to hold onto his waist just to steady myself. When he pulled back, leaving me breathless, he smirked and said, "It'll be like this." I didn't like Jimmy at first. How could I? He was my stepmother's son, and my grandmother had never trusted her. "Too beautiful," my grandmother would say, "and beautiful women are always fickle." She believed my stepmother married my dad just so he could help raise her son. For a long time, I was suspicious, always on guard. But my stepmother was kind to me, unnervingly so. She bought me expensive clothes, nicer than what she got for Jimmy. If Jimmy wanted a book, she'd make sure to get me one too, even if it was something I'd never need. It felt calculated, like a sugar-coated bribe. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Auntie," I told her one day, "please don't try to win me over like this. Flattery doesn't last, and I don't want to get my hopes up for nothing." Her smile faltered, and my dad lost his temper. He rarely scolded me, but that day he did. He called me stubborn and said I'd have a hard time getting along with people in the real world. His words hurt, so I slammed the door and stormed out. It was freezing that night, and I left without a jacket. I thought about going to my grandparents' house, but I'd forgotten my phone and had no way to call a cab. As I walked through the busy streets, I felt completely alone. Families were out enjoying dinner, kids were laughing with their parents, and couples were huddled close against the cold. Everyone had someone except me. The loneliness hit me like a wave, and I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably on the sidewalk. A kind lady from a nearby store came out and asked, "What's wrong, dear?" "You're not dressed for this weather. Come inside and warm up." Before I could answer, Jimmy showed up. "She's my sister," he said smoothly. "We had a little fight. I'm taking her home now. Thank you for checking on her." The lady believed him instantly. "Go on, dear. It's too cold to be out here." Her words stung. Why did it feel like everyone thought I was the problem? Furious, I shoved Jimmy and snapped, "Who do you think you are, pretending to be my brother?" Jimmy stumbled back, but didn't lose his composure. "Stop making a scene," he muttered, his voice steady but firm. The lady tried to diffuse the tension. "Sweetheart, it's too cold for this. Go home and sort it out." Jimmy sighed and took off his jacket, shoving it into my hands without a word. For a moment, I hesitated, but the bitter cold made the decision for me. I put it on, thinking spitefully, this jacket was bought by my dad for him. Why shouldn't I wear it? If Jimmy catches a cold and misses his exams, even better. I adjusted the oversized jacket, pulling the hood over my head until only my eyes peeked out. Jimmy walked ahead silently, and I trailed behind, my hands buried in the warm pockets. Suddenly, I felt something vibrate his phone. Before he could react, I pulled it out. He reached for it, but I held it tightly, refusing to give it back. Right in front of Jimmy, I answered a call from a girl named Lily. Her voice was sweet, almost sugary. "Jimmy, are you free next weekend?" "It's my birthday. Will you come?" she asked cheerfully. Without missing a beat, I replied in an even sweeter tone. "Oh, sorry. Next weekend is my birthday too, so he won't be able to make it." Jimmy frowned, his expression darkening as he reached for his phone. I dodged his hand, keeping up the act. "Who am I?" I repeated Lily's confused question. "Well, who else would have his phone? Isn't it obvious?" "Luna, stop this nonsense," Jimmy snapped, his frustration boiling over. He grabbed my wrist and managed to snatch the phone from me. I quickly hung up the call before he could fix it. He stood there, typing furiously, likely explaining himself to Lily. When he finally looked up, his gaze was cold, as if I were something unpleasant he'd stepped on. Without a word, he turned and walked away. The wind was bitterly cold, but I didn't feel it. Inside, I felt oddly triumphant. Vengeance fulfilled. My dad had called me stubborn and difficult. And maybe he was right, but I didn't care. As long as I was happy, nothing else mattered. When did I start liking Jimmy? It's hard to say. It was so long ago, probably even before I realized it myself. That winter break, we both joined the debate team. Since we were in the same class, the teacher put us in the same group. Jimmy was the picture of perfection, polite, articulate, and always leaving a great first impression on the judges. I was his opposite, fast-talking, relentless, and aggressive during free debates. Together, though, we were unstoppable. Our school's debate team usually didn't last long, never making it past the first round of competitions. But this time, we won every match, all the way to the provincial level. Jimmy earned the Best Debater prize, and I took home the Best Speaker award. After our big win, the teacher brought in a photographer to take a team picture. I stood in the center, holding the trophy with a grin so wide it practically split my face. Jimmy stood beside me, his faint smile calm and composed. I wore a crisp shirt and skirt. He wore a black and white shirt and trousers. It almost looked like we had coordinated our outfits, like some sort of couple. That photo became one of my favorites, but we never took one like it again. At the celebration banquet afterward, the teacher raised her glass to me. "Luna, with a sharp tongue like yours, no wonder you're unbeatable. Cheers." I was flattered and clinked glasses with her. She turned to Jimmy next, adding, "But Luna, you should learn from Jimmy. Strong arguments are good, but a friendly delivery is better. Judges like warmth." Smiling, I replied, "Yes, teacher, I should really learn from Jimmy in every way." My words sounded polite, but they were dripping with sarcasm. My dad often praised Jimmy at home, and I was tired of hearing it. The teacher didn't catch my tone, but Jimmy did. He glanced at me with his usual unreadable expression, and then ignored me entirely. For some reason, his indifference left me feeling restless. Even when the banquet ended and we moved to KTV, I couldn't shake my mood. The teacher nudged me a few times, asking why I was so quiet. Finally, I grabbed the microphone and sang a bold, patriotic song called "Loyalty to the Country." Everyone cheered. It wasn't the kind of song they expected a girl to sing. That song had always been special to me. My dad loved to sing it at social events, and when I was little, he'd often bring me along since no one else was home to watch me. Singing it felt raw and powerful, like a release. I was in the middle of belting out the chorus when Jimmy suddenly shouted my name. Annoyed, I glared at him and asked through the microphone, "What do you want?" He stepped closer, his words amplified by the mic. "Your dad is being rushed to the hospital." The room fell silent as someone muted the music. The teacher stood up, alarmed. "Luna, you should go quickly," she urged. Panicking, I reached for my phone, only to remember it was in the pocket of my jacket on the other side of the sofa. I picked up my phone and saw 5 missed calls, 1 from my dad, 1 from my stepmom, and 3 from my grandmother. My chest tightened. Dropping the mic, I grabbed my jacket but didn't bother putting it on. I ran out, dialing my dad's number with shaky fingers, but the call wouldn't go through. I must have bumped into someone while running because I heard an irritated voice snap, "Are you blind?" Before I could respond, another voice behind me apologized. "Sorry, it wasn't intentional." It was Jimmy. He had followed me. "Do you know where she is?" he asked the person. "I don't know," I muttered, too distracted by my unreachable calls to say more. Desperate, I stopped and grabbed Jimmy's sleeve. "You know which hospital, right?" I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced at me, then gently pulled his sleeve away without a word. An Uber pulled up just then, and I climbed in, leaving Jimmy behind. When we reached the hospital, my legs felt weak. My chest was heaving, and sweat trickled down my back. My mind raced with fears about what might have happened to my dad. Each step brought back memories of the last time I'd been in the emergency room, saying goodbye to my mom. The emergency room was overwhelming. The blur of stretchers, doctors in white coats, IV bags swinging from poles, and the glaring red crosses. It all seemed magnified and chaotic. When I finally found the surgery room, my legs gave out, and I gasped for air, leaning against the wall for support. Then I saw my stepmom. She hurried over, steadying me. "What's wrong with my dad?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. She smoothed back my damp hair and guided me to a chair. "It's stomach bleeding," she said softly. "He drank too much at those business dinners. But don't worry, it's not serious." I sank into the plastic chair, my head hanging as I exhaled a shaky sigh of relief. Just then, a cup of warm water appeared in front of me. The fingers holding it were long and graceful. It was Jimmy. I stared at him for a moment, stunned, before taking the cup. The warmth seeped into me with every sip, calming my frazzled nerves. For once, I didn't feel the need to argue or speak. I sat quietly, clutching the plastic cup like it was an anchor. In that moment, something shifted. I'd spent years arguing with my dad and acting cold toward my stepmom. But here they were, Jimmy and Auntie, offering me the comfort and stability I didn't know I needed. "Thank you," I whispered, closing my eyes. After surgery, my dad needed to stay in the hospital. Auntie stayed by his side, caring for him tirelessly. Whether it was for love or money, I decided it didn't matter. Her dedication deserved respect. My attitude toward both Auntie and Jimmy softened. I treated them with the same normal courtesy I'd offer a classmate or elder. With Auntie at the hospital most days, it was just Jimmy and me at home. My dad left us money for meals, so we had to fend for ourselves. I didn't eat out much because of my sensitive stomach, so I felt lost. Jimmy, being more outgoing, knew all the nearby food stalls and restaurants. I followed him like a shadow, unsure where to eat. One evening, he led me into a narrow alley. I hesitated but followed him into a small Chinese restaurant. To my surprise, the food was incredible. We ate in silence, me too focused on the delicious meal, and Jimmy seemingly annoyed by my presence. "Luna, be confident," I thought to myself, amused by my own inner pep talk. "Don't assume no." Jimmy finished eating first and paid the bill without a word, including my portion. I was surprised but didn't comment. The meal felt strangely dull without my dad and Auntie's usual chatter. The next day, Auntie came home briefly to check on things. She gave Jimmy a few instructions and reminded me about some schoolwork. Since the school didn't offer dormitories to underclassmen, I usually got a ride home with my dad for safety. But with him hospitalized, Auntie asked Jimmy to accompany me. At first, I resisted. "I can go home with my friends," I said. Jimmy frowned, and for some reason, I changed my mind. When I called him brother for the first time, his surprise was unmistakable. He asked me why I was suddenly acting so respectful toward him. After Auntie left, he brought it up again, curious about my behavior. I gave him an innocent answer. "I'm scared to walk alone after 10 at night. What if I run into a thug?" He gave me a look, then another, clearly amused. "Finally," I said, "just say whatever you're thinking." He smirked and asked, "Do thugs not discriminate?" I paused for a moment, then snapped, "Get lost." And, surprisingly, he did. Watching him walk away, his school uniform flapping in the wind like a sail, I felt a little embarrassed. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just the perfect son of my stepmother at home. He was a lively 17-year-old boy who could joke around just like anyone my age. A few days later, our provincial competition was coming up. It was a big deal since it was the first time our school had qualified, so they arranged intense training sessions during winter break. We spent our days practicing and our nights buried in homework. The debate team was full of interesting personalities, and I enjoyed their playful conversations. Tommy, the third speaker, was the joker of the group. He loved pulling pranks and would sometimes sneak out with his parents' car to take us for a ride. Peter, the fourth speaker, seemed carefree but was actually thoughtful and sharp-tongued. I often teased him about swapping debate partners, but he'd just glance at Jimmy and chuckle without saying much. During the week-long training, I stuck with them most of the time. One day, Tommy suddenly said, "Luna, you go home first today. We can't hang out." "Suspicious?" I asked. "What shady stuff are you up to?" Peter smirked and replied, "Relax. It's nothing shady. There are just places boys can go that girls can't." Naturally, I thought they were headed somewhere inappropriate. I decided it was fine for Tommy and Peter, but if they were dragging Jimmy along, they weren't leaving me behind. Half an hour later, we ended up at a fishing pond outside the city. "That's where they thought they needed to ensure my safety," Peter teased. "What's wrong?" "I thought you couldn't swim." He was right, I couldn't swim and wasn't good at fishing either. Within 30 minutes, I had annoyed Tommy at least 20 times, asking endless questions. Finally, he groaned, "Can you stop looking over your shoulder every 5 seconds? Just focus." Jimmy and Peter burst out laughing. Eventually, Peter suggested, "Enough fishing. Let's play cards." I teamed up with Tommy while Peter partnered with Jimmy. I was terrible at counting cards and kept messing up, so we lost almost every round. Jimmy, with his genius-level memory, made it worse. Tommy finally threw up his hands and said, "I can't be your partner anymore." "We're doomed," I shot back. "Weren't you the one begging to partner with me earlier? Look at you now." Laughing, Tommy darted across the room and declared, "Let's play dice. Whoever loses gets to be Luna's partner." Before anyone could argue, Jimmy stood up and sat next to me. "Let's go," he said, shuffling the cards. "I'll team up with you." I was surprised, but he stayed calm, saying good luck can turn bad, and bad luck can turn good. We started playing, but I kept breaking his winning streak. After 3 losses in a row, I felt terrible. "Maybe we should grab a bite to eat before continuing?" I suggested, but Jimmy shook his head, shuffling the cards firmly. "No, let's play again. I'll help you win." When the provincial competition finally arrived, we didn't win. But it wasn't a total loss either. It felt more like a lesson learned, and honestly, I wouldn't trade those memories for anything. As we left the stage, Tommy beamed with pride, holding his Best Debater award, while I clutched mine for debating style. But the teacher wasn't pleased. His disappointment was palpable. "Luna, why didn't you go after the third debater? He was spewing nonsense, and you just stood there reasoning with him. That's not your strength, you're supposed to be aggressive." I blinked at him, feigning innocence. "But, sir, didn't you tell me to learn from Jimmy?" Jimmy, who was standing nearby, gave a quiet smile and walked off without saying a word. We ended up in second place at the provincial competition, and while the teacher grumbled, the rest of us were satisfied. Personally, I was thrilled my dad called to say he'd be discharged from the hospital in 2 days. No more eating street food. My spirits soared. After returning on the high-speed train, we parted ways. Jimmy and I walked together for a while, dragging our suitcases behind us. We chatted casually, but as we approached my residential area, his face suddenly darkened. I looked ahead, spotting a drunk man blocking the path. "What's wrong?" I asked, But Jimmy didn't answer. The man stumbled toward us, and before I could react, Jimmy stepped in front of me, shielding me. His voice was ice cold. "How did you find us?" The man chuckled, his features bearing a faint resemblance to Jimmy's. "I can't visit where you and your mom live?" Jimmy's tone hardened. I asked, "How did you find us?" The man ignored him, turning to me. "Is this your classmate? Why are you both dragging suitcases? Where are you off to?" As he reeked of alcohol and approached me, I instinctively stepped back. "Seems like you've raised a good one," he slurred, reaching toward me. Before he could touch me, Jimmy shoved him away. "I warned you not to come looking for us," he growled. The man stumbled but smirked, clearly unfazed. Jimmy grabbed his collar, his voice dangerously low. "How many times do I have to say it? Don't come here." I stood frozen, piecing things together. This man was Jimmy's father. Before things escalated, a security guard approached, baton in hand. "What's going on here?" he demanded. I quickly intervened. "It's fine, Uncle. They know each other. Just acquaintances." Jimmy glanced at me, his eyes clouded with pain under the dim streetlight. The tension eased for a moment, but as Jimmy turned toward me, the man suddenly lunged. Grabbing a glass bottle, he smashed it toward Jimmy. Without thinking, I pushed Jimmy aside. The bottle missed him, but hit my shoulder hard. A searing pain shot through me, and I winced. The guards restrained the man, one of them already calling 911. Jimmy rushed to me, his voice urgent. "Are you okay?" I tried to steady my breathing and nodded, lying through my teeth. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. My shoulder throbbed with pain, and I could barely move it. Jimmy studied me, his gaze filled with worry. The streetlight caught his profile, his deep eyes, long lashes, straight nose, and tight lips. He looked almost unreal, like a painting come to life. For a moment, I forgot about the pain entirely. Jimmy frowned and pulled out his phone. I realized he was about to call for help. "Wait." I grabbed his hand instinctively, our fingers brushing for a fleeting moment before I let go. The sensation lingered as I rubbed my fingers together, unsure why I felt so self-conscious. Jimmy hesitated, his eyes locking with mine. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. For all the times I had clashed with him, I couldn't deny it now. Jimmy was someone with an unshakable sense of right and wrong. I knew deep down that if the bottle had seriously hurt anyone, Jimmy wouldn't hesitate to call the police. But would he really report his own father? Despite his tough exterior, I could sense the weariness and disappointment buried inside him. I looked at him and said softly, "I'm really okay. And if we call the police, they'll involve our guardians, right? You probably don't want your mom to find out about this. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been so upset, asking him over and over how he found you." Jimmy stood silent, the streetlight casting his shadow long and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I'm sorry." I met his eyes and whispered. The security guard, still holding his dad, threatened to call the police. Jimmy's dad quickly backed down. "I just came to see my son," he said, his tone pleading. "It's all a misunderstanding." Then, turning to Jimmy, he shouted, "Right, son?" Jimmy looked at him coldly, his face unreadable. "Next time, I'll call the police for sure." His dad nervously rubbed his hands. "There won't be a next time. I promise, no more." Jimmy didn't reply. He simply picked up my suitcase, taking both in his hands, and walked into the community. I stood there for a moment, empty-handed and feeling oddly pathetic. So this is what I get after being hit with a bottle, I thought. But to my surprise, what followed was even more unexpected. My dad was finally discharged from the hospital, though the doctors insisted he rest and avoid strain. Because of this, I continued walking to and from school with Jimmy. But unlike before, when he barely tolerated me tagging along, now he waited for me every time. Each morning, as we left the community, he would hold out his hand, signaling for my backpack. At first, I hesitated, unsure, but he would sling it over his shoulder casually, carrying both his and mine. I couldn't help but think of how my mom used to carry my backpack for me when I was little. After she left, Grandma took over. Eventually, I carried it myself. Watching Jimmy now, with one backpack on each shoulder, he looked a bit ridiculous, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh. Later, my dad, half joking but serious, asked, "Do you even know what it means to like someone at your age?" I wanted to tell him, "Yes, I think I do." Like that moment when the traffic light turned green and everyone else started moving. But I found myself frozen in place, watching Jimmy walk ahead. His navy blue and white school uniform fluttered in the wind, with my pink backpack slung over his shoulder like it was nothing. Years later, I'd look back at that moment, the way a girl stared at a boy from across the traffic. It was probably the first flicker of something I didn't yet understand. My relationship with Jimmy grew better, to everyone's delight. My dad was thrilled, and even his mom seemed pleased. But there was a hint of something else in her expression, something like worry. Maybe it was just a woman's intuition, but I noticed it and chose to ignore it. Instead, I started acting distant toward Jimmy again, pretending nothing had changed. One Saturday, Grandma called and invited me for dinner. "And bring Jimmy too, if you can," she added. Later, I turned to Jimmy, holding my phone. "Grandma wants you to come to dinner. Are you in?" His reply came without hesitation. "Of course. It's the first time she's invited me. I have to go." That evening, while heading downstairs to grab some water, I overheard Aunt talking to my dad. Her tone was cautious. Did Mom really invite both Luna and Jimmy? Should we double check? Dad, glued to the morning news, chuckled. "What's there to check? Luna wouldn't lie to us, would she?" "It's not that," Aunt said hesitantly. "It's just, Mom's never invited Jimmy before. Doesn't it seem odd?" Sipping his tea, Dad smiled knowingly. "She's doing it for Luna's sake." Aunt fell silent. Standing on the stairs, I suddenly didn't feel like getting that glass of water anymore. I turned and quietly went back up, only to bump into Jimmy coming out of his room. He stared at me, confused. "What are you looking at?" I snapped. "You're in a bad mood already?" he asked, surprised. "Just seeing you makes me angry," I shot back. He jumped back like I'd shocked him, his messy hair standing on end. I ignored him and slammed my door shut, pretending not to notice the flicker of hurt in his eyes. There was no water to drink in the room, and I was incredibly thirsty. My grandma always treated Jimmy well, not just because of me, but also because she knew Aunt had been taking care of my dad, which was no easy task. However, she couldn't show Aunt kindness directly, so she showed it in her own way by inviting Jimmy over for dinner. Grandma's cooking was amazing, but lately, her health had been getting worse. Her hands would sometimes shake, and it was clear she wasn't as strong as she used to be. When I took a bite of the pig's trotter, it was so salty that I immediately stood up to get some water. Grandma, rubbing her apron, muttered, "Getting old. I can't even cook properly anymore." I quickly reassured her, saying, "It's not too salty. I was just really thirsty." Jimmy, sitting next to me, picked up the last 2 pig's trotters and said, Grandma smiled, happy to hear that. I looked at Jimmy, secretly grateful. Not only was he a good grandson, but he was also a great brother. The pig's trotter was actually way too salty, but since Jimmy ate it, I didn't have to. When we went downstairs, I looked back and saw Grandma waving and smiling from the balcony. The huge window of the tall buildings made her look so small, but she smiled and waved with her eyes squinted. I waved back, hopping around in excitement. She shouted, "Be careful on the road." But by the time we turned a corner, We couldn't see her anymore. I wasn't sure if she went back inside or if she was still standing there, watching us. A sudden wave of sadness hit me as I realized how quickly time passes, and how everyone gets older and feels more alone. I kept looking back, and Jimmy stopped to wait for me. I wasn't paying attention and accidentally bumped into him. I quickly apologized, but he just reached out and ruffled my hair. It felt like he wasn't just messing with my hair, but also disrupting the emotions I couldn't understand. I held the strap of my bag tightly, suddenly lost for words. Soon after, it was Jimmy's birthday, and my dad bought him a mountain bike. I went with them to pick it out, and my dad asked if I wanted one for my birthday too. I joked, "Do you not realize how lazy I am?" Jimmy then asked the store assistant if they could add a seat to the back of the bike. I looked at him in surprise, and my dad glanced at both of us. I subconsciously curled my fingers. Even though nothing was going on between Jimmy and me, I suddenly felt guilty. My dad seemed to realize what was going on and said, "That's a great idea. Now I won't have to pick you up anymore." I relaxed a bit and casually said, "Yeah, you can stay home and drink porridge every day." After paying, we walked to the parking lot, and I jokingly said, "Aren't you worried about me and Jimmy falling in love too early?" My dad found this funny, and his laughter made the motion sensor lights in the parking lot flicker. "You two are siblings," he said, looking at Jimmy, who just nodded. In the dim light, I looked up at him, but I couldn't see his face clearly. "We are siblings," I thought. But is that all we can be? Soon, Jimmy started giving me rides to school. There were no romantic scenes like in TV shows, with a girl holding onto a boy's waist and her white skirt flowing in the wind. First of all, I couldn't hold on to Jimmy that way, and second, I was in my school uniform. Plus, to avoid raising any suspicion, I would jump off the bike and walk a little distance from him before getting to school. The first time I did this, Jimmy asked, "Aren't you tired?" I stubbornly replied, "Not tired." He just shook his head and pedaled ahead. I stood there, watching his school uniform billow in the wind, feeling like I couldn't move. If you don't have any guilt, you can be carefree. But when you do, everything feels different. During the autumn sports meet, I was reluctantly signed up for the 3,000-meter race. Since there were only a few girls in the class, the sports committee made everyone sign up for something. When I went back after submitting my homework, the only event left was the 3,000-meter race. I asked the sports committee, "Do you want me to collapse on the track?" The sports committee guy, a tall and sturdy man, almost looked like he was going to cry. He stood in front of me, nervously, and said, "Luna, I'm really sorry. How about I buy you a bottle of water next semester?" I couldn't stay mad at him after that. I ran the 3,000 meters with the goal of just getting through it. But when I ended up in last place, it didn't feel great. After all, I had people cheering for me from the stands, and the boy I liked was doing high jump nearby. So I pushed myself a little harder and managed to pass 3 other people. The sports committee and the other girls went wild, shouting my name. It felt more special than hearing your own mom's name called out. I wanted to tell them to stop because I was so out of breath, but by the 7th or 8th lap, my focus started to fade. I asked the person keeping track at the finish line, struggling to catch my breath, "Which lap am I on?" He looked at me with pity. "5th lap." Help. That's when my pace really slowed down. Someone from the inner track ran up beside me and asked, "Luna, are you okay?" I looked over and saw Peter. "I'm not dying yet," I replied, trying to sound okay. He smiled and said, "Take it easy. I'll walk with you, bro." His words almost made me laugh, so I picked up the pace a little. Finally, I reached the finish line, my chest burning with pain. I collapsed right there, ignoring the calls for help. Peter tried to help me up, but I swatted his hand away. After staring at me for a moment, he walked off. A couple of minutes later, he came back with Jimmy. Jimmy seemed surprised to find out I had been running the 3,000 meters. He crouched down and asked, "Are you okay? Should I take you to the medical room?" Peter joked. "Yeah, let Jimmy carry you to the medical room." I kicked him in the shin. Jimmy heard the joke and gave Peter a funny look before reaching out to me. "Shall we go?" Peter looked at me with a smile that almost made me nervous. Luckily, the sports committee guy rushed down from the stands, ignoring the weird vibe between Peter and Jimmy, and picked me up. "I brought you some water. Drink it later," he said, wrapping his arm around me to help me along. I didn't mind though this way. I didn't have to deal with Peter's comments, or Jimmy's awkward hand hanging in the air. The student union election was coming up soon, and the candidates for president were picked by the teachers. There was one from the liberal arts and one from the sciences, me and Jimmy. To be honest, I feel like I like someone differently from most other girls. Whether we end up together or not, I just want to be someone he remembers brightly. Even if it means giving up my own success so he can shine. When the voting results came out, I was nervous. I really wanted to win. It felt like I had to, almost obsessively. There were 7 people in the council, and 4 voted for me, while 3 voted for Jimmy. I felt proud, swinging my legs on the back of the bike, teasing Jimmy. "Oh, sorry. I got 1 more vote than you." He chuckled and said, "That extra vote was mine." I was shocked and grabbed his shirt. "What did you say?" He slammed on the brakes, turned to look at me, and smiled. "You really want to be president, don't you?" But I also wanted it for your sake. It was a Friday, the sun just about to set, casting a faint red glow on his face. Cars were speeding by, and there was the smell of fried chicken and ice cream in the air. Suddenly, I didn't know what to say. My face felt hot under the sun. "Thank you," I said quietly. "No problem," he replied, continuing to ride the bike. His school uniform fluttered in the wind. Under the sunlight, his hair looked soft, and I suddenly felt like it would be nice to touch. Hesitantly, I reached out a finger and lightly touched his hair, then quickly pulled it back. I looked around, feeling like a sneaky thief. But then I caught the gaze of a little girl eating an ice cream cone. Her big, round eyes were locked on me, and she didn't blink once. My face felt like it was on fire. Senior year of high school had come around so fast, and time seemed to be speeding by. Every day felt the same, just studying and working through piles of exercise books. My pencil would be worn down to nothing in just 3 days. Every now and then, I'd look out the window at the sunset and feel like those romantic moments from the past were so far away. Now, as seniors living in the dorms, every moment felt like a struggle. My connection with Jimmy had also become more distant. He was on the 1st floor and I was on the 4th. It was hard to even catch a glimpse of him unless we went home. In the chaos of those days, memories started flooding in. I'd lie awake at night thinking about everything. There was the time he brought me a box of ibuprofen when I was in pain, or when he took my umbrella on a rainy day and said, "I'll cover you, bro." He had also asked me what I was thinking of putting down as my first college choice. Were these small gestures proof of love? Time had its way of creating these sweet, bright memories, like shards of sugary glass. At first, they seem perfect, too bright to ignore, but when you hold on too tightly, they can cut you, leaving you bleeding. Between the never-ending math problems and my long days from morning till night, my thoughts of Jimmy started to grow wild, like weeds, taking over my focus. I began to feel like I had an allergy to him. Every time I passed by the basketball court, during morning exercises, or even just walking to the office to submit an assignment, I would spot him. Even if it was just his back or someone casually mentioning that he might get a top rank this year, it would grab my attention. And then my grades began to slip. I couldn't accept that. So I wrote a note to myself. "Luna, You're turning 18 this year. In 3 months, you'll sit for the college entrance exam. After that, you'll have the freedom to do whatever you want. But not now. Neither Jimmy nor love should get in your way. Writing that felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I bought a notebook with a lock and a small box to keep it safe. I placed the letter in the notebook, locked it in the box, and put it on the top shelf of my bookcase. I wanted to put those feelings to rest, at least for now. When the results came out, Jimmy had lived up to everyone's expectations and ranked at the top. With his level, he could easily pick any major at Harvard. My dad insisted on treating us to a meal to celebrate, trying to pull me away from the stress of all the questions. By the time I was ready and headed to the door, Jimmy was already there. When he saw me, he smiled. It's only been 2 weeks. Why do you look so exhausted? I was happy to see him, but I teased. Can't compare to the Harvard study geek. I'll just try my best to barely get into a decent domestic university. If you barely get into a decent domestic university, our grades humanities average will still be second tier, he replied, grabbing my bag and hopping into the back seat. I dozed off in the passenger seat, and when I woke up, the car was already parked outside the restaurant. It was a Sichuan place I liked. My dad asked, "So you'll definitely go to Harvard, right?" Jimmy smiled and said, "If I get in, definitely." Then my dad turned to me. "What about Luna?" I sarcastically replied, "I'll go to Harbin Buddha Institute." Jimmy chuckled, and Auntie added, "Don't ask too much. The child knows in her heart." "Right, Luna?" Not wanting to embarrass her, I nodded and said, "Yes, you're right, Auntie." My dad kept urging me to eat more vegetables and drink more beverages, trying to lighten the mood. "You've lost weight," Jimmy said. I doubted him. Really? I felt like I had gained more than 5 pounds stress-induced weight gain, deadly as always. He laughed and remarked, "Being a bit plump is good. It's festive, like the fish holding New Year's painting doll." I tightened my grip on my chopsticks and retorted, not so kindly, "You're thin, so thin, you resemble Yu Qigong standing by the door to ward off evil," he casually replied. "How could I be like Yu Qigong? I also hold a fish just like you." Auntie's hand trembled as she poured the drink, and the coconut milk spilled over. It was one of those awkward moments when words didn't quite match the mood. Jimmy went to Harvard, where he could choose any major he wanted. I, on the other hand, chose Renmin University and decided to study a niche subject. The silver lining was the distance, just 7 bus stops away. I proudly showed them the map, and my dad said, "Oh, that's good. Jimmy, please take care of Luna." Jimmy smiled and replied, "Of course." Dad seemed pleased, satisfied, and went back to watching the news. Auntie took Jimmy to the room and said something to him, but I had no idea what. In the first few months after school started, despite being so close, only 7 bus stops away, we only met once. And that was by chance. Peter, on the other hand, made quite an impression. He got into Harvard through self-recommendation. Not long after finishing military training, he invited Tommy and me to visit him at Harvard. Our group of 4 kept exchanging messages until the time and location were finally confirmed, but Jimmy never said a word. I didn't know what was going on with him, so I sent him a private message on WeChat. He took half a day to reply, saying, "I'm fine, don't overthink it." Just don't. That was it. I lost the reason to care, the excuse to reach out to him again. Several times I opened our chat window, typed something, then deleted it, word by word. Eventually, I compulsively clicked on his profile picture, scrolling through his few moments and our sparse chat history. I dissected those simple phrases like a language comprehension exercise, hoping to find something that resonated with how I felt. But there wasn't anything. Every sentence was just ordinary, like a conversation between classmates. The proofs of his liking me that I'd held onto in my memory suddenly felt elusive. Does he love me? Does he not love me? It felt like I was standing on a debating platform, with both sides being myself. Then, a sentence suddenly popped into my mind. He has never said he likes you. It's all just your imagination. The debate that had been ongoing immediately ceased. I sat there, blankly staring, thinking, yes, he has never said it, but why did I immerse myself in my own imagination, unable to get out? I felt like I was back in those senior year nights, anxious over my declining grades, now losing sleep over an unrequited crush that could break at any moment. I couldn't sleep for days. On the day we were supposed to meet, I looked in the mirror. The reflection showed dark circles under my eyes, pale skin, and a weary, feeble appearance. I suddenly got angry at Jimmy, angry at myself. Luna, are you sick? He's cold to you, yet you still go looking for him, losing sleep over him. Are you so pathetic? I angrily pointed at the person in the mirror. There are plenty of fish in the sea. Why fixate on an unattainable love? After cursing, I felt a sense of relief. The person in the mirror still had pale cheeks, but there was a different spark in her eyes, not as despairing as before. I quickly freshened up, blew my hair into a fluffy curl, and asked the girl from the next room, who was good at makeup, to help with my look. Afterward, she glanced at my wardrobe and said, "Luna, why don't you even have a dress? Take this. Consider it a lucky charm." She handed me her supposedly lucky outfit. When I looked at myself in the full-length mirror again, the person in the reflection was still me, same eyebrows, same face shape. But somehow, I looked much prettier, as if I could be described as charming and coy, even just by casually swearing. I had made a comment about myself that gave me chills, and my hair stood on end. I said goodbye to the girls, and one of them smirked, saying, "Wish you success." They all knew I had a crush on a guy from Harvard, but they didn't know that we hadn't spoken in a while. The last time he had been online was when Tommy tagged him in our group chat, and he replied, "Oh, I wasn't at school that day, sorry." I tried to ignore the curious looks from the girls and forced a smile. "All right, wish me success," I said, though I couldn't help but wonder how I was supposed to succeed. As I walked and chatted with Tommy and Peter, I suddenly spotted Jimmy on the road outside the cafeteria. I knew I wasn't going to be able to keep up the act of being calm. Jimmy was wearing a black down jacket, the one he gave me after that argument with my dad when I left home. He seemed a little taller, his hair a bit shorter, and he was carrying a packed lunch. He walked quickly, and Tommy noticed him first. "Hey, isn't that Jimmy?" he asked. Peter smirked, looking at me. "Yeah, isn't that Jimmy?" he said. I looked at him coldly. "So what?" I replied. Peter whispered, "Luna, don't be tough." Before I could respond, Peter called out Jimmy's name. Jimmy paused, then turned around. I could see it clearly. He had grown taller and was a little tanned. When he saw us, his face blanked for a moment before he hesitated and stepped closer. "I thought you had something to do and weren't at school," Tommy asked. Jimmy smiled and replied, "It got rescheduled last minute." Peter smiled too, teasing, "You're not being fair, not telling us it got rescheduled. Didn't want to see someone here, maybe?" He glanced at me as he spoke. Jimmy looked at me, paused, then smiled. "No, it's just a coincidence," he said. Tommy asked if we'd had lunch yet, and when we said no, he invited Jimmy to join us for barbecue. If Jimmy had turned it down, it would have been awkward, so of course, he agreed. As we dodged passing bikes, Tommy said, "College is so much better. You can just casually have a pretty girl sit on the back of your bike. Who would dare to do that in high school?" I froze for a second and quickly glanced at Jimmy. He caught me looking and casually turned away. Peter then said, Jimmy would dare write Jimmy? He was talking to Jimmy, but his eyes were on me. I slowly replied, Peter, you're not making sense. Peter laughed. Luna, I was talking about Jimmy, not you. Why are you so protective of him? Tommy, clueless, tried to defuse the situation. What's going on? Let's just eat and stop fooling around. I ignored him and stared at Peter. Who are you really talking about? Don't you know yourself? Peter smirked, but his eyes lost all humor. He turned to Jimmy. Do you know what's going on? I'm talking to you, but you keep talking about her. What's the deal? Peter's gaze was intense, and he calmly asked, and why are you always defending her? Tommy looked at both of us, confused, but before anyone could say anything else, Jimmy spoke up. So, you figured it out. I gave Luna a ride. There's nothing to hide. We're siblings. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He really thought that way he and I were just siblings, with a bond I could never cross. Peter stood there for a moment, then turned to me. You guys are siblings? He asked. Jimmy looked at me, his face partly hidden by the shadow of the streetlight, making it hard to read his expression. I finally managed to speak, my voice sounding stiff. Yeah, I lost my mom when I was in elementary school, and my dad and his mom got married and started a new family. The noise around us seemed to fade as our group went quiet. Tommy broke the silence, saying, Hey, don't take it too hard, Luna. Peter didn't mean to hit a nerve. Let's eat. We sat down and ate barbecue, but I couldn't enjoy it. The conversation continued like it always did at team dinners, but I felt miles away from everyone else. Tommy was chatty. Peter and Jimmy kept things light with jokes, and I teased them now and then, laughing most of the time. But deep down, I knew that every word I said, every smile I gave, was fake. I was pretending everything was fine, pretending this get-together was like it used to be. But it wasn't. I wasn't okay. Not at all. When we said goodbye, Tommy said, Luna and I will leave first. Peter waved and said, Sure, see you next time. I looked at him and said, Goodbye, but he looked guilty, like he wanted to say something more. I didn't want to hear it, so I turned to Jimmy and said, Goodbye. This time, he didn't look away. His expression was soft, almost tender. Goodbye, Luna, he said. Goodbye. Goodbye to the person I used to like. Goodbye to my brother, Jimmy. After that, I didn't reach out to him again, and he didn't come looking for me either. Fine, I thought to myself. There are plenty of handsome guys out there, one less won't make a difference. If he wanted to be just a sibling, then fine, let's be siblings. Who's afraid of who? I threw myself into spending time with my friends at the club. We'd have dinner together, and everyone would drink too much. Afterward, we'd head to KTV moving crates of beer, laughing and shouting. Luna, you're from the north. You must have a high alcohol tolerance. They all cheered. I could handle some alcohol, but when it was a mix of beiju and beer, I didn't stand a chance. I got drunk and passed out on the couch, sinking into a long, fragmented dream. In one part of the dream, I was sitting on the back of Jimmy's bike, watching the beautiful sunset. The ice cream was delicious, and I don't know where I found the courage. But I suddenly hugged his waist. He looked back, smiling at me. Luna, we're siblings. I felt awful. When I looked up, I found myself back on the track where we had run the 3,000 meters. Jimmy reached out his hand to me, and just as I slowly took it, Peter appeared, chuckling. Luna, I already knew. But you didn't, did you? You and him, it's impossible. Don't you know that? I shouted at him to shut up, but instead of Peter, Auntie appeared. Luna, was it your grandmother who asked Jimmy out for dinner that day? Or did you lie to me just to go out with him? I screamed that I hadn't lied. that I knew we were siblings and had held back so much. So why were they still pushing me like this? I was suddenly jolted awake. The flashing lights from KTV danced around me, and the music thumped in my ears. I could barely make out someone standing in front of me, but tears from my eyelashes blurred my vision, making me close my eyes again. My head hurt, and my stomach twisted. Someone handed me tissues, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw Jimmy. He was standing there in a white shirt and black pants, his lips pressed together in an unreadable expression. "Am I dreaming?" I asked, still dazed. Lisa, who was sitting nearby, laughed and said, "Don't blame me. You looked like you were going into shock just now. I unlocked your phone with your face, and he's the only contact you have." Jimmy's lips curved slightly, but it was quick and faded. I glared at Lisa. "You must want me dead," I muttered. Lisa laughed. "No way. Girl, he's pretty cute. Seize the opportunity." "Shut up. He's my brother," I snapped. Okay. Lisa shrugged, patting Jimmy's shoulder. "Be understanding, Jimmy. Luna gets irritable when she drinks too much. She's not usually like this." Then she went off to sing, leaving me and Jimmy in the corner. It was so quiet, the silence stretching out between us, broken only by the sad love songs playing in the background. I grabbed my bag, took Jimmy's wrist, and led him out of the room. As soon as we reached the hallway, I let go of his hand. The corridor was much quieter now. Jimmy looked at me, his eyelids drooping slightly. "Aren't you going to say something?" I sighed. "What do you want to hear?" Jimmy chuckled. "Anything. Like, why you drank so much. Why you're still out here at 1 a.m. Why the only contact in your phone is me." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and all I could hear was the buzzing in my ears. "Shut up," I said, feeling the pain in my stomach tighten. There were no pharmacies open in this area at this hour. I crouched down on the roadside, holding my stomach. Jimmy, who had stubbornly been following me, wouldn't leave me alone. When he saw me crouch, his face changed. "Is your stomach hurting? Did you drink too much?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Can you please shut up?" He went quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Can you please just leave?" "I'm not leaving," he replied firmly. After a short pause, he added, "Let me take you to the hospital." The memories of the emergency room from when I was in elementary school came rushing back, those stretchers, crying patients, and the pitiful looks from the doctors. The thought made my stomach ache even more. "I'm not going," I said, clutching my side. Jimmy crouched down beside me, gently wiping the sweat off my forehead with a tissue. "I've called an Uber," he said softly. For some reason, that moment felt familiar, like déjà vu. The sound of a car rushing past filled the quiet road, and the streetlight above cast a soft glow on his face. His eyes looked at me with nothing but care and concern. I spoke up, my voice shaking. "Jimmy, don't be so kind to me. Don't make me misunderstand." He didn't respond right away, just stayed silent. Then a car came down the road from the west. Jimmy breathed a sigh of relief, stood up, and waved. "Sure." We didn't talk again until we were inside the car. As my stomach throbbed with pain and dizziness started to take over, I rolled down the car window to let the cold Massachusetts wind hit my face. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked, "Young lady, are you drunk?" I didn't answer, too tired and irritated to care. Jimmy spoke up, "Yeah." The driver looked at us again, then asked, "Are you two young lovers having a fight?" I snapped, "We're not a couple. He's my brother." The driver laughed lightly. "Oh, I must have been mistaken. You two don't look alike at all." I closed my eyes, the colors outside the window blending into one streak of light. I felt myself drifting off, But then I suddenly heard Jimmy's voice. "You didn't mishear," he said slowly. I opened my eyes wide and stared at him. "What did you say?" I said. "I like you," he replied, his voice steady but full of something deeper. I froze for a second, shocked, then grabbed my bag and hit him hard, yelling, "Don't mess with me!" He grabbed my wrist, stopping me. "Although this isn't the right place for this, I think. I really like you." I was completely stunned, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. The driver interrupted us, chuckling. "Young man, what's this?" "Confessing in my car? You trying to make things difficult for them?" The comment wasn't funny, but I found myself laughing, though it was a laugh that choked up in my throat. It hit me how we hadn't spoken in months, not even through social media. He had pushed me away for no reason at all, saying we were siblings. Fine, I thought. If we were siblings, I'd treat him like one. "Now you suddenly tell me you like me?" I said, my voice rising in anger. "Why don't you just drop dead?" Jimmy's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Before, I wasn't sure. I was confused. I sneered. "So now you suddenly figured it out?" He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I'm still not sure, but I feel like any man would confess in a situation like this." I stared at him, confused. "What situation?" "When you were asleep, you called my name and cried," he said softly. The driver chuckled and clicked his tongue, clearly trying to make light of the tension. But it only made everything feel heavier, suffocating. Damn it, I thought. This was Lisa's fault. Jimmy's eyes remained on me, his expression patient, like he was waiting for me to say something. "If you say you like me, do I have to agree?" he asked, his voice low and vulnerable. I looked at him coldly, my chest tight. "Ever since the day you said we were siblings, it's impossible for us. There are plenty of handsome guys chasing after me, so who do you think you are?" He looked down, crestfallen. His face dropped, and in that moment I felt even more broken than before. Confessing my feelings shouldn't have been like this. I always imagined it happening on a quiet evening, with the moon just starting to peek over the treetops, and the sky still a soft, hazy blue, maybe by a lake or at the base of a mountain, dressed up, looking my best, and telling Jimmy that I liked him. If he said yes, everything would be perfect. If he said no, I wouldn't feel embarrassed. What mattered most was keeping my composure. But none of that happened. It didn't take place in the setting I dreamed of, and there was no romantic moment. Instead, it happened in a taxi, with the driver barely holding back his laughter. It felt awful. Just when I thought I might explode, Jimmy cleared his throat. I looked at him, noticing he seemed a little nervous. He spoke to the driver, asking him to stop laughing. The driver chuckled and said, "I just love seeing you young folks falling in love." Then he put on his headphones, and the car went quiet. The streetlights flickered on and off, casting shadows across Jimmy's face, making it light up one moment and then go dark the next. Jimmy cleared his throat again, and then said, "At first, I didn't like you. I thought you were a spoiled princess with an attitude sensitive and bossy. But then, don't pinch me, let me finish." I stared at him, feeling a little hurt. He didn't notice and kept talking. "Later, when you stepped in and protected me from that bottle at the bar and didn't even cry from the pain, I thought maybe I had judged you wrong. After that, I started to find you really cute. You're smart and good-looking. I guess I started liking you." He laughed nervously. "Hey, stop pinching me. Even when I'm saying nice things, you still pinch me. Don't move." He grabbed my hand tightly, our palms pressed together, making my heart flutter. For a moment, I was too scared to even move. He said softly, "But we're like siblings, and I've always felt like I shouldn't like you." So when I realized I did, my first reaction was to think, no, that's wrong. I shouldn't feel this way. It would hurt you. I'm sorry. Siblings? My heart dropped, and I pulled my hand away. Are you talking in your sleep now? His hand reached out and gently took mine again. The lights from passing street lamps lit up his face. The boy I once liked, stubbornly holding on to my hand, his ears turning red, but trying to stay calm. He whispered, "Now I feel like saying to hell with being siblings. If I like you, then I'll admit it." I couldn't help but laugh, and as I did, my eyes filled with tears again. Jimmy wiped the tears from my face and said softly, "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to make you sad. It hurts me to see you upset." I pulled my hand away, but a tear fell onto the back of his hand. His hand froze, and after a moment he said, "Or you could hit me or yell at me. Just stop crying." I punched him a few times, and he laughed, pretending he might need to go to the hospital. He wrapped his arm around me, and I felt a warmth spread through me. The night felt magical, like time had stopped. The person I liked was holding me close, caring for me. My heart was racing, and I felt a soft kiss on my forehead. He whispered in my ear, "Luna, let's be together." And we are. Now, whenever he doesn't have classes, he takes a long bus ride to have dinner with me. The winter in Massachusetts is stunning, with clear, deep blue skies. I sit on the back of his bike, finally able to wrap my arms around his waist. I rest my head on his back, the breeze brushing my face, and sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. Jimmy just smiles and asks, "Have you wanted to do this for a long time?" I smile back and say, "Haven't you?" He laughs and replies, "I'm a serious guy." I playfully pinch Jimmy's waist, and he quickly changes the subject, saying, "But if you're willing to call me brother, I wouldn't mind." I tease him back, saying, "Brother, I want a kiss." He laughs, but then suddenly slams on the brakes. The moon has just risen over the treetops, and the sky is still that soft, hazy blue. The bike stops right at the base of a mountain. He grabs my hand and starts walking forward. I ask, "But we haven't reached the top yet, right?" Without turning around, he says, "But your brother wants to kiss you. My dad knows I have a boyfriend now, and Jimmy's mom knows he has a girlfriend. They've both agreed that during the winter break, we should all come home and have dinner together. If they knew the four of us were actually just two, they'd probably kick us out. So, we decided to keep it a secret for now. At home during the break, we were super polite. My dad quietly asked if Jimmy and I were having any issues. I looked confused, and he chuckled. As long as everything is fine, that's all that matters. After a pause, he added, "If he did anything wrong, tell me or your aunt. Don't keep it to yourself. Be a little forgiving since you're siblings. It'll pass." As soon as he said the word siblings, I remembered when Jimmy had said, "Screw the sister." I shot back, "Are we siblings? Do we have a blood relationship?" My dad seemed even more convinced that something was wrong between Jimmy and me. He tried to comfort me, saying, "Okay. Don't get upset. You've only been back a few days, so don't scold me." I stared at him and repeated, "Not considered siblings. You said it yourself." He sighed. Yeah, not considered siblings. We're doing a big cleanup tonight, don't forget." I pretended to forget. Then Zhang called and asked me to go shopping, and I happily took the chance to slip away. But if I had known slacking off would lead to such serious consequences, I never would have done it. My dad called me back, his voice heavy, saying only a few words before hanging up. I messaged Jimmy, but he didn't reply. A bad feeling crept up on me, so I called my grandma and asked her to remind my dad about our dinner tomorrow. Grandma laughed on the phone. "Did you make your dad angry again by messing up?" I pretended to be clueless and chuckled. Then she said, "Okay, but when you get home, apologize to your dad and show some humility." Grandma had always been my savior, and with her advice, I felt a bit better. When I got home, the lights were bright and the place looked spotless from all the cleaning. My dad was sitting on the sofa, holding a piece of paper, his face so serious it looked like it could drip water. I saw it clearly. There was an open box on the coffee table with a broken lock beside it. That was the box where I'd hidden the love letters, and now the lock was broken. I didn't feel scared anymore. Instead, a wave of anger surged through me. How dare they go through my room and snoop around? My dad slammed his hand on the coffee table, his voice sharp. "Watch your tone." I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I put the box on top of the bookcase. "How did you get it?" "It was locked." "How did you open it?" "You saw the letter I hid, so you think it's justified, right?" Auntie, standing next to my dad, spoke up, "Luna, when I was dusting the bookcase, I accidentally knocked over the box, and the lock broke. There was a notebook inside, and when I picked it up, this letter fell out." I turned to look at her. Her face, usually gentle and smiling, was now completely emotionless. "Auntie, tell me the truth. Is what you wrote in that letter true?" she asked. I forced a smile, which felt more like a grimace. "Auntie, I wrote it for myself. There's no need to lie." My dad suddenly roared. "Luna, he's your brother!" Auntie asked again. "Is Jimmy the one you dated in college?" Without flinching, I looked at her and said yes. In an instant, my dad slapped me hard. The sound of the slap echoed in the room, and I turned my face away, feeling the sting of the blow. It seemed like my dad was shocked by the loud slap he'd just delivered. His hand stayed in the air for what felt like forever, before he slowly lowered it. He didn't say anything after that and just slumped back onto the sofa. At that moment, the door opened and Jimmy walked in. Without even looking up, he started chatting and laughing. I went downstairs to buy fruit, and the whole family got together. "Why are you crying?" I really hadn't planned on crying, but the moment I saw him, I couldn't hold it back. Jimmy placed the fruit in the hallway and then looked at us seriously. He clearly noticed something was off, but he stayed calm, even bending down to grab a tissue from the coffee table and handing it to me. "Why are you crying?" he asked softly. My tears fell even more as Auntie asked, "Jimmy, are you dating Luna?" Jimmy answered without hesitation, "Yes." Auntie seemed taken aback by his honest response. She choked up for a moment before saying, "Before you went to study in Massachusetts, I told you to take care of Luna like a sister. Did I say that?" After a pause, Jimmy replied, "You did." Auntie continued, "I also said that you're both grown-ups now and need to maintain boundaries, not overstep them." "Did I say that?" Jimmy answered again, "You did." Auntie went on, "Then why didn't you listen?" Jimmy hesitated, then said quietly, "Because I like her." My dad spoke up, "You two are siblings." Jimmy laughed softly and replied, "But nobody asked if we wanted to be siblings." The room fell silent for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Finally, Auntie asked, "Are you blaming your mother for this?" Jimmy stopped laughing and said seriously, "No, because you have your own life. But I don't want you to be angry about this. I have my own life, too." The tension of the moment broke when my grandmother called. I don't know what she said, but after my dad hung up, he told us to leave him alone. He didn't want to talk anymore. I put the letter back in the unlocked box and carried it upstairs. It felt like I was walking to a funeral. Jimmy followed quietly behind me, saying nothing. Auntie called out to him, "Jimmy, you're sleeping in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, I'll have someone switch your room with the study. Our house is a duplex. The master bedroom, guest room, and main study are downstairs, while upstairs, there's my bedroom, and my study. Later, Jimmy moved into my study, and it was turned into his bedroom. Jimmy stopped in his tracks and let out a ridiculous chuckle, saying, "Mom, is this really necessary?" Auntie replied calmly, "We didn't think things through before, but now we can fix it." Jimmy, don't make it harder on Mom. Jimmy clearly wanted to argue, but when Auntie spoke those last few words, he clenched his fists. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Okay, I couldn't take it anymore." Holding the box tightly, I trudged up the stairs. I heard footsteps stop at my door before moving on. I stood behind the door, clutching the letter, tears falling onto it. The ink smudged as my tears mixed with the paper. I used to think that the biggest obstacle between us was the college entrance exam. I believed that if I could just get through that, everything would fall into place. I thought of him as my belief, my reason to push through and succeed. But now, I realized that the entrance exam was just a small bump in the road. The real obstacle was far bigger, and it hurt more than I could have imagined. I hugged my knees and cried. The pain felt endless. The next morning, when I went downstairs for breakfast, my eyes were swollen. My double eyelids had turned into single ones. On the table were fried dough sticks and steamed buns filled with pickled vegetables and tofu, my favorite. I immediately recognized them as being from my favorite store, the one on another street that my dad rarely bought from because it was too far and always had a long line. But this morning, it was on the table, and it was only 7:30. My dad was still sitting there, watching the morning news, not even glancing at me. I picked at the bun, tears falling into the soy milk bowl. At first, I felt really upset, but now I just felt so tired. He finished his meal, grabbed his briefcase, and left. Before closing the door, he said, "We're going to Grandma's for lunch today. All of you should come." I looked up at him, but he didn't look back. With a loud bang, the door slammed shut. Grandma had made braised pork with vermicelli, and it smelled amazing. But the food wasn't the most interesting part. The real focus came when Grandma said, "Luna, come take a walk with me to help with digestion." Grandma lives in an old neighborhood where we know everyone. As we walked, we bumped into a lot of familiar faces. "Oh, Luna, haven't seen you in ages. You've really grown into a young lady," they said. Grandma smiled and said, "Yes, she's become quite the young lady." Once the people left, I focused on stepping in the snow. Grandma asked, "Are you dating Jimmy?" I had been expecting this, so I answered quietly, "Yes." Grandma chuckled, noticing my swollen eyes, and said, "Look at you, all puffy. You're really hopeless." I shrugged and replied, "Well, I've been hopeless for a while now." Grandma then asked, "Do you know why your dad is so upset?" I said, "A man's heart is as deep as the sea." "How would I know?" Grandma poked my forehead and said, "You're heartless. Your dad just worries about you." She paused before continuing, "He didn't want me to tell you this. He thinks you're too young. But let me tell you, it's important to understand social norms early. The sooner you do, the less likely people will take advantage of you." Confused, I asked, "What does that have to do with social norms?" Grandma looked at me seriously. Take Jimmy's mom, for example. You and Jimmy aren't related. You both are good, decent people who know each other well. So, why does she get involved? Because she's worried about what people might say. If you two get married, will she be part of your family? Or is she after your dad's inheritance? My face turned bright red, and I blurted out, "Why are we talking about marriage?" Grandma waved her hand, signaling me to stay quiet, and went on, "I'm asking if your relationship with Jimmy is meant to last forever, or if you're just having fun." I didn't know how to answer, so she smiled and said, "That's what I thought. Sooner or later, this will come up, and you can't avoid it. Your dad has always had only you. The inheritance he and your mom worked for is all yours. But things change. If Jimmy marries you, your inheritance becomes his too. Won't your mom's family be upset? Won't your dad and aunt lose face? Luna, this isn't just about you and Jimmy. Do you understand? I stood there, stunned, not paying attention, and stepped into a snowdrift. The cold snow water seeped into my shoes, but I didn't feel it. That day, I didn't argue about inheritance. I knew every word Grandma said was important. The biggest obstacle between me and Jimmy wasn't my dad's or aunt's wishes, it was society's expectations. A rule that had been passed down through generations. Grandma always said, in life, you need love, money, but dignity matters most. I stood there in the snow, my feet freezing, but I didn't feel it. Grandma told me to think it over and that she'd talk to Jimmy again. Soon, Jimmy came downstairs. As he passed me, he stopped and reached out to rub my cheek, asking if I was cold and telling me to go inside. I looked up at him, calm as usual, unaware of what was about to happen. Jimmy, I started. My grandmother used to be a Chinese teacher and later became a school principal. He just made a sound, like he didn't know what to say. So I went on. She's really good at convincing people. He smiled and asked, did she convince you? I didn't answer right away. He reached out and ruffled my hair, not saying anything deep, just telling me to go back inside so I wouldn't catch a cold. As he walked toward Grandma, his black jacket swayed like a sail on the ocean. After Grandma and Jimmy talked, the three of us went upstairs together. I purposely slowed down to stick close to Grandma and asked, how did it go? She knew exactly what I meant, but pretended not to. What do you mean? She asked. Annoyed, I pressed. What did Jimmy say? She looked at me for a moment and said, if this were World War, someone like you, would have switched sides in an instant. But he stays true to his word. Grandma walked up the stairs with her hands behind her, ignoring me. I stood there and laughed a little. Later, my dad and aunt didn't say much and just acted like they hadn't noticed anything. Jimmy and I went back to school early, just like my dad suggested, avoiding each other when we didn't need to interact. Jimmy worked especially hard. He was already at the top of his class and working on a business project with his seniors. When we weren't together, he often stayed up late working. I had a feeling it had something to do with me, so I asked him what he told my grandmother, but he wouldn't say. After I kept asking, he smiled, touched my cheek, and dodged the question, saying, Luna, your dad and grandmother really love you, you know. I asked, and you? He chuckled. Of course, why else would I work so hard to build my future wife's dowry? My face turned red. I could guess what he and Grandma had talked about. As my dad once said, the ability to stop gossip is real power. But back then, his main goal was to push me to focus on my studies, to prove my worth through school, not by fighting with boys. I don't think he expected that I would be the listener while Jimmy would be the one actually following through. One day, I tiptoed to kiss Jimmy, catching him by surprise. By the time he reacted, I was already running off. He grabbed my hand and gently pressed it to his forehead. The sound of the computer in the small room made the silence feel even stranger. I noticed his Adam's apple moving up and down. Before I realized what I was doing, my hand touched it. He looked at me, eyes lowered, and said, Luna, do you know we shouldn't mess with a guy's Adam's apple? I asked, what happens if you do? He leaned in to kiss me, and as I held onto his waist to catch my breath, he calmly explained, it ends up like this. The light was perfect, with a soft spring breeze. We held hands, so close that we could hear each other's heartbeats. I leaned my head on his neck and whispered, Jimmy, I feel like I'm dreaming. He sighed and said, it seems like we haven't been close enough. I picked up a cushion and tossed it at him, but he caught it and set it aside. The sunlight filled the room, highlighting his features. I could see my blushing face reflected in his eyes. All the feelings of uncertainty I'd been carrying disappeared in that moment. It was like all the dreams I had written down were really coming true. The tears I'd shed were being wiped away by him. The love I thought was hopeless was turning into something real. The road ahead might be tough, but as long as he was by my side, that was enough. I hugged him tight and said, "I've liked you since I was 17. He whispered in my ear, "What a coincidence. I feel the same way."